Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to have a great webinar today. I'm joined here with Ian Smith from Americans United for Separation of Church and State. We're going to get started here in a few minutes. People are going to trickle in. So while we're waiting, I'm just going to make a couple of quick announcements. First of all, we hope you can join us at our next webinar, which is April 5th. And that's going to be Anatomy of Prejudice with renowned anti-racism activist Jane Elliott. So please join us for that. That's going to be great. Also, if you're one of our students with SSA, make sure to get your chapter registration in by April 8th. That is the deadline we need in order to process all your information. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to get started here in a quick minute. Thank you for checking in. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please put them in the Q&A box. We're going to do a Q&A session at the end. So let's just hang on a minute. But please join us at our next webinar, April 5th. Jane Elliott, that's going to be fantastic. We're really looking forward to that. Today with me is Ian Smith. He is going to be talking to us about knowing student rights, specifically surrounding the law about religion in public schools, and he's going to give a brief discussion of the upcoming Supreme Court case on the subject, Kennedy v. Bremerton School District. Did I say that right, Ian?
Bremerton.
Bremerton, okay. We're going to get started here in a couple of minutes. People are still trickling in. I love your background, Ian. That's looking great.
Thank you. It's new, so I decided to try it out today.
Awesome, great. Really looking forward to having a great discussion here. Give everyone a few more minutes. If you didn't hear me earlier, if you're one of our students with SSA, please get your chapter registration in by April 8th. We very much need that by then. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar on the 5th with Jane Elliott. Once again, if you do have questions throughout the webinar, please put them in the Q&A box. We will do that at the end. All right, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is our webinar about knowing student rights, and I'm joined with my amazing guest, Ian Smith from Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Ian, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Sorry?
Thank you for having me.
Oh, pleasure's ours. He's a staff attorney, and he's going to be giving us an overview of the law surrounding religion in public schools, and it's going to be a brief discussion of the upcoming Supreme Court case as well, Kennedy v. Bremerton School District. So without further delay, Ian, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Again, my name is Ian Smith. I am a staff attorney at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. I have been at Americans United for 13 years now. I'm going into my 14th year, so I've been doing this for a while. That also means that sometimes I can zoom through this stuff, and if one of the valid questions is if you need me to actually go back and explain something in more depth that I just sort of did a flyby on, please ask. The Q&As are the best parts of these anyway. But my job at AU specifically is that I do all of our legal intake. So anytime anybody out in the world has something that they think might be a church-state violation or unconstitutional, they write into us and it comes to me, and I evaluate it. I apply the law to the situation, try and determine whether there's a separation of church and state violation, and if there is, then I write legal letters to whatever government entity is doing the violation, explaining what the law is and how they're not following the law, and then asking them to stop what they're doing or to change what they're doing to bring it in line with the law. I also wrote our Know Your Rights guides, which this will largely be based on. We did some Know Your Rights guides for students, parents, and teachers A lot of the same information in each of those documents with some variation depending on, some stuff that parents need to know that students don't necessarily need to know, that sort of thing. But we'll largely be pulling from those today. We'll go over some really common situations, specifically since this is a secular student alliance, we'll focus on what students face in public schools and, how the law applies in those situations. Let me start off by giving a very broad overview of the legal frameworks that go into these situations. There are really two major frameworks that you need to know about for public schools and how religion in the public schools works, right? The first has to do with coercion. So it is always a church-state violation if the government, any government, but especially a public school, is coercing you into religious activity, whether against your will or not, really, but especially against your will, right? So if you don't want to do something religious, but they make you, that's coercive, right? And coercion of someone to do a religious activity is pretty much always unconstitutional. You can also have indirect coercion, which is where the government does something that puts social pressure on you to do something that you'd rather not do. Also usually unconstitutional. But while we like to say in the legal profession that coercion is sufficient but not necessary. So while coercion is, if you have coercion, then you've got a constitutional violation pretty much all the time. You don't have to have coercion to have a constitutional violation. That's where the other framework comes in. It's gone by a couple of names. The most common is the Lemon test. And without getting too technical, what it really breaks down to is that the governments can't do anything that has a religious purpose. So they can't do something for the purpose of engaging you with religion or endorsing religion. And they can't do anything that, regardless of whether they mean to or not, regardless of purpose, has the effect of endorsing religion, right? So if they started a class and they intentionally put religious content in the curriculum, that's acting with a religious purpose. But even if they didn't know, even if they did something completely by accident that endorsed religion, the endorsement would be enough, right? So Lemon technically is one of these weird three-pronged tests, and you violate the Constitution if you violate any of them. But those are the concepts that you really need to remember, right? Did they act with the purpose of endorsing religion, or did whatever it is that they did actually have the effect of endorsing religion? The effect prong is really important. A lot of people would like to ignore it. I get a lot of public schools that I write to say things like, hey, we didn't mean to endorse religion, or we didn't mean to make anybody uncomfortable. And whether you meant to or not, you did, and that's unconstitutional. So with all that, let's start getting into some specifics. I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly so we can move to the Q&A. I hope people will ask tons of questions, because I find that those tend to be a little more fun with these. But before I get into the student stuff, I want to start with teachers and what teachers can do, because that will let me talk a little bit about Kennedy versus Bremerton, which is a case in the Supreme Court that my organization will be arguing coming up. The oral argument will be on April the 25th, so very soon now, and then it will probably be decided by the end of July. So teachers, what can teachers do with regards to religion when they're on the job? The answer is they can't pray, right? They can't, while they are acting as a government official, they cannot endorse religion. So they can't tell you to go to church. They can't tell you that you should be Christian. They can't tell you that this religion is true or that religion is false. The other thing that you can't do with regard to the separation of church and state is the government can't denigrate religion either. It has to remain neutral, right? So no endorsement, no denigration. So teachers can't pray with students when they're on the job. They can't, give students religious materials, all those sorts of things, right? They can't hang religious things in their classrooms. They can do things in private, away from students, right? Where they're not doing that indirect coercion thing, right? Where they're not putting like social pressures or modeling behavior Like if they go to the teacher's lounge, they can read the Bible there, or pray there, or whatever. They can wear small items of religious items in their clothing, like crosses or yarmulkes on their head, stuff like that. But engaging in overt religious activities with students has generally, up until now, thought to not be okay. Brings me to Kennedy versus Bremerton. I wanted to talk a little bit about it just because it's very imminent and might be of interest to people here. So the fact pattern of Kennedy is Kennedy was a football coach at a high school in Washington State. For years, for I think about 7 years, he led the team in prayer before and after games, and he would go out to the 50-yard line like immediately after the game was called and over. He would go out to the 50-yard line and he would kneel down and he would do a prayer. And after he'd been doing that for a while, it started to be a thing where all of his players would come around him and circle up and pray with him. And then he would give them a little speech where he talked about God and proselytized them. And then it started to be that they would invite the other team out there. And so for years, he had these like giant huddles with his team and with the other team and the other team's coaches where, he'd be proselytizing and praying with them, right? So when the school eventually found out about it, they told him he had to stop the pregame and postgame prayers. And then he had to stop the midfield prayers, but he agreed to stop the pre and post game prayers. He said, okay, fine, then yeah, I can't do that. But he resisted on the prayers in the 50-yard line. And so they offered him all these accommodations. They're like, look, we'll set aside time for you, a place for you to go where you won't be around students and you can do your thing. Or you can come back when all the students are gone and do your thing at the 50-yard line, right? When you're not on the job. Or you can come to us and work with us and we'll try and figure out a way for you to be able to do this just without, endorsing religion in the way that you're not supposed to do. He didn't take any of those accommodations, right? Like he went out into the media and like stirred up like a giant frenzy amongst the community, saying that the school was threatening to fire him over praying. And it got people like got really mad, made like death threats to the principal and the superintendent and all the people that they thought were stopping him from praying. At one of the homecoming games, he had actually stirred up so much of a frenzy that the crowd rushed the field, knocking over players and refs and other coaches and all that sort of thing, and so that they could all like pile onto the 50-yard line. And so the school district eventually put him on administrative leave for the reason that he kept disobeying them, right? And so Kennedy has been suing the school district for quite a while now, right? Probably about 5 years. And so this has eventually worked its way up to the Supreme Court. It was up before, but then got denied. And Alito and some of the other justices showed some interest in it and made some comments that suggested they'd be interested in taking it. Now they have. Our organization is representing the school district, and that will be argued on, like I said, April the 25th. We'll see what happens with it. We'll see what happens with it. I got to read our brief today, a draft of our brief that will be filed probably by the end of the month. It's fantastic. We should win this, but with the current Supreme Court, who knows? We'll have to see. I did see somebody asked what part of the Constitution does it say separation of church and state. It's a common question. The words separation of church and state do not appear in the Constitution, but the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. This is technically called the Establishment Clause, and it is understood by, it's been understood by every court that's ever looked at it for, since the founding of the country to represent the concept of a separation between formal religion and government, right? And you can't establish a religion. That's what the Establishment Clause means.
And Ian, just to interrupt briefly, just please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them at the end. Please do not put them in the chat box.
but yeah, that's a very common question that we get a lot, right? But it's that very first clause of the First Amendment that says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, which has been extended to anticipate another question that is very common, extended to the states via the 14th Amendment. The civil rights amendments after the Civil War that sort of extend a lot of the protections of the Bill of Rights to the states. The First Amendment has been, and the Establishment Clause specifically, have been incorporated against all the governments, state, local, and federal, via the 14th Amendment. So even though it says Congress shall make no law, what it really means now after the 14th Amendment is government shall make no law. And make no law doesn't just mean like legislatures or whatever. It means like formal, like administrative government policies at every level, right? Like any policy that you've made to implement government action counts. So that's what we're dealing with, the Establishment Clause. Although I will tend to just say separation of church and state because I've been told by our comms people that I shouldn't use the legal terminology as much. So let's talk a little bit about, and I'm happy to answer questions about Kennedy versus Bremerton if people have them as well. To the extent that I can. There's some stuff I can't talk about because we're still writing the brief and everything, but a lot of this is in the public record now. So let's talk a little bit about students' rights in public schools. And these generally are going to be applied to secondary and lower schools. So, elementary, middle, and high schools, although some of this stuff does apply at the collegiate level as well. Although because students at the collegiate level are older, there's a little bit more, the courts give a little bit more leeway to the government in some of these areas, not all, but some. So first thing, prayer. It's always a big topic, right? You hear politicians talk about putting prayer back in schools all the time, right? So is there no prayer in public schools? Well, there's no official prayer in public schools, right? You can't have government-sponsored prayer in public schools. But students can pray in quite a few situations, right? So you don't, as a student, you don't surrender your rights when you enter a public school. And one of those rights is the First Amendment right to free exercise of religion. The thing that you can't do is you can't disrupt the activities of the school, right? So when you're in between classes, when you have free time, like at lunch or, during a free period or whatever, you can go off and, pray by yourself or with others as long as you're not being disruptive. Excuse me. You could, but you can't stand up in the middle of class on your desk and start praying and then say, hey, it's my religious right? The teacher can tell you to be quiet. So student prayer can be done. It can be done silently in class because that's not disruptive, but pretty much any time that it's not disrupting the activities of the school. You're also not allowed to harass other students. So like if a student doesn't want to pray with you, you can't keep after them about it, right? Like they have just as much of a right to not engage in the exercise of religion as you have to engage, right? And any kind of harassment the school can put a stop to because that's, again, disruptive. This is actually a framework that is used for pretty much all kinds of student speech. You'll see the courts talk about this sort of thing with regard to political speech as well, or any other kind of student speech. Pretty much anything goes as long as it's not disruptive. Also sort of leads us into the question of student expression of religion. I differentiate between the two because here we're talking about can you talk about religious topics in an assignment, for instance? And the answer is sure, as long as you're following the directions of the assignment. So for instance, if you're assigned to write a paper about a historical figure, you can talk about Jesus or Muhammad or any other religious figure that's a historical figure, right? But what you can't do is if you're assigned to write a paper about Abraham Lincoln, you can't then inject religious views into that paper and just completely ignore the assignment, right? You can't talk about Jesus instead of Abraham Lincoln. You have to follow the assignment. But within that context, within those bounds, right, within whatever the school's asked you to do, if religious expression fits within whatever the school's asked you to do, generally speaking, you're allowed to do that. Next. So what about religious content in the curriculum? So what can the school can the school put religious stuff into assignments and other things like that? And the answer is it depends on the context. So a public school can teach factual information about religion, right? Like, so if you're in a social studies class and they want to teach you about what Muslims believe or what Christians believe, right? They can do that as long as they are not endorsing it, because they're not saying you should believe this or you should follow this particular religion, or alternatively, you shouldn't believe this is all crap. You can't say that either. But they have to have, generally speaking, if they're going to use religious materials, they have to have a non-religious reason for doing it, right? There has to be the term that teachers use and that lawyers use is pedagogical purpose. So there needs to be like a learning purpose for using religious materials like the Bible or stories from the Bible or whatever, right? A favorite example of mine is the story of God helping Moses to part the Red Sea, right? So the school could not teach that in a history class as if it actually happened, because whether God came down and parted the Red Sea to help the Israelites escape Egypt is a matter of faith, right? Because it requires you to believe in the existence of God, believe that he can perform miracles, believe that there was someone called Moses and all of the rest of it, right? It can't be used in that context, because that context requires faith in order for it to make any sense. But let's say you're in an English class, right? And you're reading something and the author uses the phrase parted the Red Sea, right? And you actually see some like an allusion like that pretty commonly in a lot of works. And if you don't, the school can then tell you the story, can explain to you the contours of the story to help you understand the allusion. That's a non-religious purpose for communicating that story to you, because you can't understand the reference without understanding the original story. That's the kind of context we're talking about here, right? So schools have to be careful about how they use materials from the Bible or the Quran or any other religious document. They got to make sure that they have a non-religious reason for presenting those kinds of materials to you. The same rules apply to basically anything that can be viewed as even vaguely curricular within the school. Assemblies, school plays, field trips, right? Anything where the school is trying to communicate something to a student. They have to be careful to have a non-religious reason for using any religious materials. One sort of like big, broad kind of personally, I think, weird exception. I don't know if I should call it an exception, but an area that is commonly kind of a sticking point on this is music classes, because it's they're supposed to follow generally the same rules. You can include religious songs in a school choir, but only if you choose them for non-religious reasons, right? So the teacher has to be able to say, I picked this particular song, which has religious content, but I did it because it teaches a particular vocal technique that I really want, and I think it's the best way to teach that, right? They have to have that kind of that kind of reason, right? You can't have a performance that is overwhelmed by religious content, like religious songs, right? Like we see this especially on holidays, like Christmas concerts. There would just be one religious song after the other right down the set list, right? You can't have that. And students have to be allowed to opt out of singing religious songs without any penalty, right? Because if they're made to sing religious content, that can be viewed as a form of coercion, coerced religious activity, right? Courts are a lot more lenient with schools about religious music than I would like. They tend to view religious music as a sort of necessary part of choral education, which I don't agree with at all. But somebody somewhere decided that, Western choral canon is just full of religious music. And so it's inevitable that some of it's going to be there. So we have to play around the edges. But generally speaking, like I said, they need to have a religious reason and follow those other rules. So that's mostly how things work in terms of like the curriculum. What about another big topic is religious displays, right? So I think I mentioned earlier, school cannot have official religious displays like on the walls. Can't put crosses on the walls, can't put the 10 Commandments up, pictures of Jesus, Bible quotes, can't do that sort of thing, right? Like generally speaking, if you can see a religious display in a public school that the school has put up, it's probably a violation. There are ways in which religious displays can go up, but generally speaking, they are student displays, right? So like if a teacher has a bulletin board where they put up student projects or student art, like student art projects as just a very common example, right? And a student does a religious project, they can put that up on the wall without having to worry about whether they're, endorsing religion unconstitutionally or something like that, right? As long as it's treated the same as everybody else. They can't treat it better, can't put it front and center, like, right, can't be bigger than everything else. But, generally speaking, if they're just showcasing student speech, student communication, student work, and some of that work happens to be religious and they treat it the same as everything else, fine, it can go up in that limited context. But the school officials, school itself, can't put up religious displays. That's unconstitutional. Jump back to another thing with students, what students can do. So let's talk a little bit about religious clubs. So this is kind of difficult to talk about because there's a lot of weird circumstances that surround clubs in public schools, but generally speaking, you have what are called curricular clubs. So clubs that are related to whatever it is the school's doing, right? And that generally includes things like anything that can even be vaguely related to what the school's teaching. Like French, if a school has a French club, right? That's a curricular club. If there's a French class, right? Math club, National Honor Society, those sorts of things are curricular clubs. They're run by the school. Teachers run them. They don't depend on students to run, to create them and run them and all that sort of thing. Those clubs can't have religious content, just can't, because they're official school activities and the school can't engage in religious content. On the other hand, there are also things called non-curricular clubs. This is to say clubs that are not related to the curriculum at all. Like if you have like a comic book club or something like that, right? Not related to the curriculum. Generally speaking, I mean, you can make an argument that it's related to English class or whatever, but generally speaking, not, right? So anytime that the school allows students to create non-curricular clubs, it is required by federal law, a federal law called the Equal Access Act, to allow students to create religious and philosophical clubs, right? So if a student wants to start a religious club, they can. You get a lot of what are called good news clubs and other sorts of things. Fellowship of Christian Athletes is an incredibly common example of this, right? So those have to be started by students. They have to be run by students, and only students can take part in the religious content in the clubs, right? Most schools will require any student club to have a teacher sponsor, and a student-run religious club can have a teacher sponsor, but the teacher can only be there to monitor behavior and to help them like navigate like school bureaucracy and stuff like that, right? Teacher can't be involved in any of the religious stuff in the club. But that law, if there are student religious clubs, it also says that there have to be philosophical clubs. So that it also gives students the rights to make other kinds of clubs, like gay straight alliances is a common one, right? And that's true even if the school administration has a problem with those sorts of clubs. So keep that in mind. But yeah, so students can start religious clubs, right? As long as they're the ones running them and they're the ones doing the religious stuff, not teachers. There's teachers are awful at this. They will constantly involve themselves in the religious activities of student clubs, even when they're not supposed to. So it's good to know, right? You can start one, but the teachers can't participate. Okay, let's talk a little bit now about distribution of religious materials. So the school, generally speaking, can't distribute religious materials to students, right? School can't hand you a Bible, right? That's unconstitutional. The school can allow students to distribute materials if it's non-disruptive, just like with prayer, right? It's a form of student speech. If it's non-disruptive, they can allow, although they don't have to allow necessarily. Well, maybe in off times, right? Like when you're on your own, like at lunch or, before and after school and stuff like that, students can distribute materials. And the school can't really prohibit it if it's not disruptive. But any kind of distribution in class, pretty much always going to be disruptive. At official school activities, can be viewed as disruptive, right? They've got some leeway to stop, distribution for those reasons. But again, as with prayer and as with other kinds of religious speech, if it's non-disruptive and done on your own time, students have the right to distribute those kinds of materials. School generally cannot allow outside people to come in and distribute materials to you either, right? So a lot of times in the fifth grade, specifically the fifth grade, because this is a thing, like schools will allow the Gideon Society, the Gideons, the people who put the Bibles in hotel rooms, right, to come in and distribute Bibles to fifth grade students, right? They come in, set up tables, and then like either sometimes teachers like march their classes past in a line and they just hand them the Bibles. Sometimes they leave them alone. Pretty much any of these instances are unconstitutional, right? During the school day, school can't allow its property to be used to distribute those kinds of religious materials. That said, one thing you will see schools do, which is okay, is sometimes schools will put together these things that we call Friday folders. They're not really folders anymore. This is terminology from like cases that are like 20 years old now. These days, you'll actually see them more on online distribution platforms, but oftentimes schools will package together like advertisements for community events, like, hey, come to this, pizza party or whatever that's happening at this time after school on this day, right? And as long as the school sort of treats anybody that wants to like have an advertisement equally, you can have religious community advertisements shoved into those Friday folders, and the school is not legally responsible for that, not considered to be endorsing religion by doing that, right? So if you see that, that's often okay. It's pretty common. Like and frankly, churches are way better at taking advantage of those communication systems that are meant to go to parents, right? Like, hey, you should send our kid to this after school program or this mixer that we're having or this pizza party that we're having, right? They're way better at utilizing it than other things are, like other groups are. So you'll often see like religious advertisements for religious events that go into those things, but that's not illegal, right, for the school to do. So long as if they did get a non-religious flyer, they would treat it the same as the religious flyer. Promise we're closing in on the end of me yakking at you. Just a couple more things. Let's talk about the using houses of worship for school activities. So very common to see public schools use churches, and it's almost never anything else, right? You basically never see a public school use a mosque or a synagogue for anything, right? Almost always churches for choir concerts, graduations, any kind of large meeting, right? Sometimes assemblies, sometimes they hold classes in churches, right? Like you actually have like physically public school classes held in a church, right? So we say at Americans United, public schools should not use houses of worship for public school events. period, right? There's way too much danger of a church-state separation violation. But technically, it can be done legally if, and only if, there is no visible iconography, religious displays, stained glass windows, Bible verses, anything like that in the areas that will be used by students, right? So if you've got, some churches have these like areas that are just basically big concrete rooms with a lot of seats in them. They don't have anything on the walls, right? There's no crosses, no religious displays, nothing like that, right? If you just stuff kids in that, right, for an awards banquet or something, that might be okay. Not if they pass a cross on the way in, but it's possible, right? But that often doesn't happen. Like most of the time when you see a school using a church, they're using the main sanctuary hall with a giant cross and stained glass windows and Bibles in the pews and all that, right? And if you got that going on at an official public school activity, you've got a constitutional violation. One sort of related thing that you might have heard of is called release time. Release time has been around for a while. Like there was a Supreme Court case about it back in the 1940s, so a long time, right? And what that term refers to is sometimes schools, at the specific request of parents, will let kids out of school to go to a church off-site, off campus, to have religious instruction and then come back to the school for the rest of the school day, right? So it's release time because they are released from the school's custody. They go over here to have religious instruction and then they come back for the remainder of the day. Some schools allow this by parent choice. They don't, and the school's choice. It's okay for them to do that as long as they're not like encouraging students to go to release time and they're not punishing students that choose not to go. Some states actually require by law that schools allow release time when parents ask. So if you see something like this in your public school, they may not have a choice, or they might. It just depends on where you are. But the big things there are they can't endorse it, they can't tell you should go, and they can't punish you for not going. And by punish, I mean like we've seen sometimes if like you have a classroom of 20 kids and 15 kids go to the release time and the teacher gets angry because they'd like to have a free period. And then so they give the kids busy work, right? Or they make them, write something over and over and over again. That's punishing them for not going. You can't do that. They have to keep on, right? As if nothing was wrong or different. Because that's coercive. You can't coerce people to go to church or engage in any religious activity. So can't do that sort of thing, right? All right, two more. First, religious accommodations. So a religious accommodation is when you, as a student, ask the school to change a rule or exempt you from a rule because of because it would create a religious hardship for you, right? An easy example of this is Muslim students will sometimes need to pray multiple times a day, right? And that can sometimes involve them needing to leave class for a brief moment, do their thing, and then come back, right? So requesting the ability to do that when you're normally not allowed to just get up and leave a class as it's going on is an accommodation. It's an example of an accommodation. So the normal rule for this is that schools are not required to provide a religious accommodation, but if they do provide religious accommodation, they have to treat everybody the same, regardless of religion, right? So, if a Christian student requests that they get an exemption for a holiday that they need to be out of school for, then the school has to treat that request the same as it treats a Wiccan's request to be out of school for a religious holiday, or a Jewish student's request to be out of school on an excused absence for a holiday, right? Once you start giving religious accommodations, you have to treat all religions equally. That's basically the big rule. You don't have to do it, but if you do, treat everybody the same. Finally, holiday stuff, since I just mentioned holiday things, right? So A lot of times, schools and other government offices will close on religious holidays. Is that legal? Well, it's legal if they have a non-religious reason for the closing. The most common non-religious reason that is given for closing a government office is too many people will be absent, right? People won't show up on this day. So we have an operational necessity to close. Doesn't make any sense to open the school if 90% of our teachers will be gone and 80% of our students will be gone, right? We just can't do that, so we'll close, right? This is a pretty loose legal standard. Like, as long as the school or the government office is making a even vaguely good faith argument for why they need to close, courts pretty much say okay. But if they're blatantly just saying, yeah, we're closing because it's a religious holiday and we want people to be able to go to church, can't do that, right? You cannot close for the purpose of enabling religious activity, right? You can't do that. It's one of the, like I said, basic framework. That's a religious purpose. You can't have a religious purpose for a government activity. And then what can schools teach about religion, right? So schools can teach factual, or what can schools teach about religious holidays? Excuse me. Schools can teach factual information about religious holidays, right? Like, this holiday, its traditions come about because of these religious beliefs. But again, they got to be careful. And holiday celebrations in the school pretty much have to stick to non-religious versions of the holiday. Now, what do I mean by that? So, like, courts can be of two minds about things, especially for religious holidays that have moved into the sort of very common cultural zeitgeist. The easiest one is Christmas, right? So a school can have a holiday celebration of Christmas. They can have decorations that deal with Santa Claus and trees and reindeer and presents, right? All those things are part of the non-religious cultural expression of Christmas. But what they can't do is, put up a nativity scene, right? Because that is about the religious portion of Christmas, about the birth of Jesus. So again, you got to have that separation between something that's non-religious and secular and something that is, a portion of it that's religious. Now, this isn't necessarily fair, right? Because a lot more Christian holidays and things have moved into sort of this cultural mode, right? Than, say, Jewish holidays. You don't find a lot of commonly federal holidayed Jewish holidays, right? But it is what it is. That's the way the law works on this. And we work with what we have. Generally speaking, courts are pretty lenient about this, but school can't put up a nativity scene or have a nativity play, right? That's generally the thing to think about holiday closures. All right. That is a whirlwind tour through a whole bunch of stuff. If you have any questions about things that teachers need to know, like there are a couple of things that are unique to teachers that I haven't touched on here very much, but it seems like a good time to open it up to questions. And if I zoomed past anything that you'd like to ask more questions about, please do. I'm happy to answer anything.
That was a lot of great information, and we really can't thank you enough for coming to speak to our students and everyone and give us that, because I know, like, these are things that I didn't know when I was in public school and things that I would have really benefited from. I actually had a government teacher. She taught AP government, who just put up the 10 Commandments on her wall and basically just dared us to report her. Yep. And no one did, because, we just didn't know or didn't really care. And
people tend to put their heads down and just sort of power through that sort of thing. I had many teachers that put crosses up on the walls and things like that. And we had prayer at graduation, like basically anything you want to name, it happened at my school. I grew up in Knoxville, just outside Knoxville, Tennessee. So the South.
Yeah. Well, it happens here in California too, just so you know.
Oh no, it is. I don't want to make it sound like it is just a Southern phenomena. This stuff happens all over the country, everywhere.
We do have some great questions, and if we don't get to your question, it's because I felt it was already answered or it was answered by another question. So I'm sorry if you feel like I didn't get to your question. So our first question, are teachers on the job when serving as a student-led club advisor? So this goes back to what you're talking about, clubs. And when are the volunteer coaches considered on the jobs or on the job? And this kind of goes back to what you're saying. So I guess the question is more asking, when do they go from being public employees to volunteers?
Yeah, great question, because this is, I mean, that is squarely what is going to be talked about in Kennedy versus Bremerton. I can tell you what it is right now, might be different 6 months from now. One of the fun and stressful things about being a constitutional lawyer. So for school clubs, right, even though it says it's a student-led club, right, and even though some student-led clubs meet after school, right, as long as it is created within that framework of an official school club, right, where you have to ask the school's permission and they assign like the teacher advisor and stuff like that, the teacher is always on the job, right? Because this is not, even though it's a religious club, it's still a school activity. It gets a pass because the students are the ones engaging in the religious activity and the school is just making that available to them as an opportunity, right? So the school it's like an accommodation. So, but the teacher is never not on the job when they are acting as an advisor for a school club, okay? And the same goes true, is basically true right now anyway, for something like a coach, right? Like part of the coach's job is to be a role model, right? And to like model behavior for students. And so even though a lot of that modeling happens outside of traditional school hours, right? So games happen in the evenings, practices happen in the afternoons, after school, before school, stuff like that, right? They're still present and doing what the school hired them to do, right? There's a lot of law and very technical legal jargon about how you figure stuff like that out, and it's not necessarily tied to, you know, their job description or what's in their contract, but you have to look at the practical reality of what it is that the school has actually is actually hiring them to do and what it wants them to do, right? But generally speaking, right, like, I mean, like, you have to think about a coach, right? Like, what a coach only has access to students because they're employed by the district. Like, a random parent doesn't just get, or a person off the street doesn't just get to walk onto the football field and start speechifying to a group of students. They get tackled by security, right? Like, that's not how this works.
Well, I would hope they would get tackled by security.
One would hope, right? Yeah, it doesn't always happen, but you know, like, so that's sort of what you're thinking about here, right? Like, is this person cloaked in the authority of the school? Like, are they doing what they're doing because the school has given them permission, the school wants them to be there, right? That's sort of the broad way to think about stuff like that. It's actually a bit more complicated than that, but, you know, there have been a lot of Supreme Court cases about stuff that had happened after school. There's a famous one from Texas about prayers over the loudspeaker at football games, right? Where the other side, as we like to call them, argued that, you know, because it happened after school, wasn't really an official school activity or whatever, right? But the court didn't buy that, right? They're like, look, you know, a football game or a basketball game or a pep rally or whatever, right? It's cloaked in school colors, right? The school helped to organize it. You're there because the school wants you to be there, like all that stuff. Those are school activities just as much as class is.
Thank you for that. This one is very specific, so I'm assuming this is something that this person is dealing with. Would a school board member placing a religious motivational speech on his official, and I assume when they say official, they mean his school line, official telephone answering system that everyone must listen to before leaving him a message, constitute a legal violation?
Yeah, I would say probably yes. So
it's a very specific question.
Yeah, school board members are especially weird, right? Like, because they only sort of like part-time government officials, right? Because they have other jobs. Mostly they have other full-time jobs that they do, and they only come to do school board stuff, you know, when they have meetings and other things like that. But And this question actually gets asked a lot these days about newer forms of media like Facebook pages and Twitter accounts, right? People put Bible quotes in their bios, or will retweet things and put stuff up on their Facebook wall that's religious, right? And so the thing you generally want to look at for something like this is whatever it is, whatever mode of communication you're talking about here, is whatever it is being used either exclusively or mostly for governmental business, so in this case school board business, or is it a mix, right? If this is like, if your school board member in question here, it runs a used car dealership, right? And in order to get in touch with them, you have to call the dealership, and the dealership has you're just getting the dealership's answering service, then maybe not, right? Because they're tying that to something private and not something governmental. But if like when you call that number, they say, this is such and such school board member District 5, and this is how they do all their communications with constituents, and they use it for school district business, right? Then yeah, that's governmental. They've made it governmental. And generally speaking, governmental communications aren't supposed to be religious, aren't supposed to have religious content.
Yeah, and I would assume it also gets tricky because they're elected officials as well, not most of the time.
Once you're elected, right, and doing the job, right, you're governmental, right? Politicians get away with a lot of stuff, and they get away with a lot of stuff with regard to religion. But once you are elected official and you are doing the job for which you were elected, you're governmental, right? And just the same as an elected congressperson can't pass a law, endorsing religion, you can't enact a policy or use official channels. You can't use the government. You can't use the platform that you've been given because you're elected to endorse religion or to denigrate religion or to do any of these other things that are prohibited by the Establishment Clause. But you do have to separate the private sphere from the governmental sphere, right? Because private religious communications, perfectly fine, right? I'll give one example of a politician that's actually really good at doing this is Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio has 3 different Facebook accounts. One for his senatorial stuff, his official senatorial stuff, one for his campaign stuff, and one for his personal stuff. And he does not he posts religious stuff liberally on his personal page and sometimes on his campaign page. Campaigns are actually private, they're not governmental. But on his official page, never, right? And that's the way it should be. That's perfectly fine.
One of my favorite West Wing lines is, what happened to separation of church and state? And the president says, there's no law about separating religion and politics. So,
right. Yeah, very true.
And this kind of goes off what you just touched on. Is there a difference in application of the Establishment Clause between public and private K through 12 schools?
Yeah, private schools, as long as they're not funded directly by the government, and there's some caveats to that, but as long as they're not directly funded by the government, can do what they want. They're private, right? Like they want to endorse, you have tons of private religious schools, right? And they can endorse religion as they want. They're just like churches in that way. They have free exercise rights. And if they want to, if parents choose to send their students there, fine, go for it, right? We don't have any problem with that. Neither does the law. Where you start to get into trouble is things like charter schools. Charter schools are technically public schools, and so they have to follow all the same rules that public schools follow because they get the majority of their funding through public school funds, right? But a lot of them treat themselves like they are private, which they're not. So charter schools have to follow separation of church and state. Private schools, not so much. You'll see a lot about vouchers. As an organization, we're kind of anti-voucher just because it ends up siphoning a lot of money out of public school coffers into the coffers of private schools. But according to the Supreme Court, voucher money going to private schools that are religious is not an Establishment Clause violation, because the court says the money is the government gives government money to the parents, and then the parents decide where the money goes. The government doesn't actually care once the parents have the money, even though technically that's not at all how this happens, right? Like the government actually cuts a check directly to the school that they choose, right? So that's a bit of a legal fiction, but still, we call that a circuit breaker, a break between what the government's action and what the government's responsible for, and something private, right? And in this case, the fact that the parent is the one choosing to spend money that has been given to them, right, at a religious school, not the government's responsibility once the money's gone and out and in their hands.
Yeah, great. That's exactly kind of what I was hoping you would say. I'm going to sort of tweak this question to make it kind of more on topic what we're saying. Basically, it's about our national motto, "In God We Trust," and the fact that in the Pledge of Allegiance there is "Under God," and this came from the 50s at the height of the Cold War. But this person says this kind of feels like a violation of church and state and the Establishment Clause, and just wants to know your thoughts and Americans United thoughts.
Yep. Yeah, a lot of people feel this exactly the same way. So I apologize for what I'm about to say. Not a violation, right? It's been litigated dozens of times, over and over and over and over again, in almost every permutation you can imagine, right? Litigated about it being on the money, litigated about it being on public buildings, right? In God We Trust, and some other things like Ohio's state motto is "With God all things are possible." There's various things like that, right, that are out there. The courts call these things ceremonial deism, and what they mean by that is that through common usage, they have lost whatever religious meaning they may have originally had, and now that they're used in a context that is non-religious. I don't personally buy that. I don't find that to be a terribly persuasive argument, but at this point, for "In God We Trust" especially, you ain't not getting anywhere with that, right? Like, it's over and over and over again said the same thing. Specifically though with the pledge, right, with the "Under God" portion of the pledge, there is a Supreme Court case, I believe it's called West Virginia versus Barnett. The government can't make you say the Pledge of Allegiance. That's actually a free speech thing as much as it is an Establishment Clause thing, right? So challenging the "Under God" portion of the pledge under the Establishment Clause would probably get you the same result as "In God We Trust." They'd say it's ceremonial deism, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But if you just say, "I don't want to say this," right? The government can't make you say it. The government, as a general First Amendment principle, free speech principle, that the government cannot force you to say something you don't want to say. There are a lot of like contours to that and specific caveats, but like if you have a problem saying the Pledge of Allegiance, like you are perfectly within your rights to not say it. A lot of schools kind of get very upset if students do that, but like the law is very clear on this. They cannot make you say it.
Yeah, and I think that I'm glad you were able to clear that up for us. This person asked two questions. I'm gonna make them into one. Can students have religious clubs during school hours, and what are school policies about release time for any non-school activity?
So, student clubs can meet during school hours, after school hours, whenever other student clubs meet, as long as they follow the same rules as the other student clubs. So yes, if your student club meeting times are during like, third block or whatever, and that's when student clubs meet, student religious clubs can meet at the same time. Treat them exactly the same as you would every other non-curricular student club. As for release time for other like religious, like sort of allowing students to be released for other kinds of activities. Like we actually start to see this sometimes with like going to church or other sorts of things. if I think we don't see this a lot, right? Schools don't like to release students. They just don't. Like I have my best friend is a public school teacher. He absolutely hates this stuff, right? He hates it because it's a giant like suck out of any time that you have, right? To lose like a portion, an entire lesson because people just leave. Like he hates it, right? So schools don't like to release students out of their care, right? But I think the general way to think about this, if you ever do encounter it, is do they treat religious and non-religious things the same, right? So if you release students for religious stuff, you may need to release students for non-religious stuff. I mean, it's a little tough because we really only ever see this in the release time, like go for religious instruction context. But occasionally you'll see things like a school will have a program where you can be released to go to the local community college and take an advanced course and get course credit for it. And then the question is, can they also do that for courses at religious colleges, right? Can students get course credit for doing things like going and having a seminary course or something? And again, it depends a lot on like, is the school trying to get you to go out and go do the religious thing? Are they encouraging it? Are they giving you special benefits for doing it that they don't give to anybody else? Generally speaking, the more equal they treat that sort of thing to non-religious things, it's probably okay. That would be the kind of situation where I'd really need to see exactly what a school was doing to be able to answer it with any more, I think, specificity.
Great. 2 more questions. About Kennedy v. Bremerton, students voluntarily join the prayer. Does the participation of students change the legality of the prayer speeches done by the coach?
So it's a good question. Like in my brief explanation, I said the students decided to go out and join the prayer, and that's sort of true, but you have to think about the context, right? And this is part of what we talk about, what we're going to be talking about in front of the Supreme Court, right? For a student athlete, coaches are massively important, right? They control whether you play. They control the fact whether or not you play controls whether or not you get a scholarship on that sport, right? Like they're seen as leaders. They constantly push like the idea of like cohesion of the team, right? So if you as a student athlete see the coach out there and you see all the rest of your team gathering around him, even if you don't want to go, you're going to go, right? And that, in fact, in Kennedy is actually what we saw. There were a couple of weeks there where the school district told Kennedy he couldn't do it anymore. And so he went off and did something different, right? There were a couple of weeks where he didn't do the prayer on the 50-yard line. And the students, left to their own devices, didn't huddle up and pray. They just didn't do it, right? And so, I mean, Kennedy's actions, I like to say, even though this is just me, I like to say that what he was doing was a show to prompt engagement, right? I don't think he gave it. I mean, I don't think he was out there because of some deeply felt. I mean, he might find prayer to be a deeply like held religious purpose. I don't doubt that he's a sincerely religious man. But the reason that he wanted to do it, where he did it, when he did it, was because he wanted the students to see it and to come join. That was the point. And that is a problem. You do see in school athletics, students voluntarily choosing to huddle up and have a prayer after games or before games or whatever. And as long as school officials aren't pushing that or participating in it with them, that's perfectly fine. Students choosing to engage in prayer on their own is perfectly fine.
All right, last question. If we think a violation does occur, how would one go about reporting it? Who would be the first point of contact to resolve the issue?
Great question. Thank you for asking it.
I saved this for the end on purpose.
Yep, great. Thank you. So on our website, you can go on our website on the front page in the upper right-hand corner. There's a little button that says "Report a Violation." You can click on that and fill out the form. And what will happen then is that it will go, whatever it is that you write there will go to me. like I will read it because everybody that fills out that form, it all comes directly to me. And if I'm not there, then then somebody else in the legal department monitors the box where all of those go. That's the easiest way to get a question answered. And even if you think something might be on the borderline, or you don't know, maybe this is not a violation, maybe it is, ask, right? Because a lot of this stuff is really like finely grained. It relies on a lot of like legal stuff that's not necessarily easy to explain, and not necessarily common sense either, right? And we would much rather you ask. And I don't mind, I will tell you if it's not, right? Like, believe me, 90% of everything that comes in to us is not a violation, right? And I tell people that, and I don't mind, because that's part of what I do, right? Part of Americans United's mission is to educate people about church-state separation, right? So if you have a question, if you have a situation that you think might be a problem but you're not sure, go fill out the complaint form. It's only I see it. It's anonymous. We'll maintain people's anonymity, right? I do have to say, please fill out contact information so that I can get back to you. I often have to ask people additional questions. We won't do anything, like I won't write a letter or do anything else without permission, right? So you're not like committing to, me sending off some angry legal letter to your school, right? If you fill out the form, right? And even if we do write a letter, in 99% of the cases, we keep people completely anonymous. So unless there is some reason that we can't do that, just because people get nervous about talking about this sort of thing. But that is absolutely the best way. Just go to the website, click the report a violation button, and fill out the form.
All right. Ian, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. I know that you gave us a lot of information and you took a lot of questions. I'm sorry.
I should say, sorry to interrupt. I should say, also on our website are the Know Your Rights guides. So if you need a refresher on anything that I talked about here, you can go on our website and search for Know Your Rights, and you'll find the guides, and they have all this information in what we hope is a fairly easy to read like format.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming to talk to us for this past little more than an hour. Everyone, thank you for your participation and your great questions. If we didn't get to your question, I'm sorry, but we're running out of time, and a lot of the questions were a bit repetitive, so I tried to consolidate as much as I could. Our next webinar is going to be April 8th with renowned anti-racism activist Jane Elliott, so we hope you come and join us for that. Ian, thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me.
Have a great day, and everyone, thank you so much for coming to join us, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone.